Looks like we're working now. Okay. Good afternoon or good evening as it is to those who are joining us by the recorded lesson. We're studying this course called Prophecy and the Prophets. You remember that Brother Gene Taylor is the author of this study. And we started out way back talking about just the general idea of prophecy. And now we've come down to some of the actual prophets. We've studied some of the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We've studied the oral prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Now we're looking at some of the more minor prophets. Minor doesn't mean that they're less important. Minor just means that they wrote less. There's less about them. And so as we talk about prophets like Hosea, which is our subject for tonight, we kind of keep that in mind, that he is there among all those great prophets of God. And that just because he has a short letter doesn't mean that it's anything less important than some of those who wrote 40, 50, 60 chapters. Remember that last week we talked a little bit about the name Hosea, and that it means deliverance or help, or God is salvation. We also talked a little bit about where he worked. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, even before it was captured by the Assyrians. So even though he could have prophesied anywhere, his work was mainly with those northern tribes. And one of the things about Hosea was that some of his personal life was brought in as a way of comparing how God deals with the people of Israel. Hosea, remember, had a wife. Anyone remember what his wife's name was? Gomer, right. His wife was Gomer. And we know something about her. We know who she was the daughter of, and we also know that she was a harlot. That's pretty strictly stated in the scriptures, kind of bluntly. And Hosea was instructed by God, remember, to take this woman as his wife. It wasn't something he just stumbled into, but God directed him to marry Gomer, and they did produce 3 children, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later in the lesson. But he had 2 sons and a daughter, and as we study them, we'll note that their names have something very important to do with the whole story here. But then, what happened? Did Gomer remain faithful to Hosea? Nope. She departed from him and played the harlot with many different men. Apparently, lovers were coming and going all through that part of her life. And, you know, she did not seem to be swayed by the nature of what she was doing. However, in chapter 3 of this letter, Hosea relates how God instructed him to buy her back. Not only was he to take her back as his wife and treat her just as he had at the beginning, it was that he had to purchase her. He had to buy her back. I'm not sure how that worked, but you know, maybe there was some kind of a middleman, we might call him a pimp today or something like that, that had to be paid off to get her back. But anyway, the whole picture of what Hosea went through with his wife was comparable to what God did with Israel. Israel was God's chosen. Israel was the chosen of God, and when Israelites turned to idols and pagan worship, that was like Gomer going off into harlotry again. And that's how God describes it. But God still loved his people, and when the time was right, he paid the price by sending his son Jesus and bought them back. Now, Jesus is yet to come in the time of Hosea. He's a prophet. He's writing about something to come in the future. But God did take the people of Israel back in a sense. They were taken captive by the Assyrians, but they did come back, and some of them at least resumed worshiping as they should. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But for tonight, we want to talk about a few more details concerning this book itself. And if you note on the screen up there, we're showing a section of our textbook where the date is under consideration. And I'm sorry it's kind of small print there, but if you'll take your course book and take a look there and get back to that. Page 63 down at the bottom is where this section on the date starts, if you need to be able to see it a little better. Those are all the last ones. But here, we're not going to spend too much time on this. Just to illustrate, though, it is important to know when these writings are done, because it helps us establish the context. What was this writer talking about, and how does it fit with what was going on at the time? And so the date that most authorities think this was written was between 750 and 727 BC. Now, you know, these BC dates, the smaller they get, it's closer to present time. All right, so during that period there, maybe 50 years or so, is when Hosea probably wrote all this. And if you remember your history, the northern kingdom of Israel was taken captive by the Assyrians about 722 BC. So Hosea's prophecies lasted through much of the last generation or two of the kingdom, and finally ended up with the just before the Assyrian captivity. Some of these different things that Brother Taylor has for us here are quotations or references from different sources, and let's just look at a couple of them. One of them is from Zondervan's Bible Encyclopedia. Zondervan is a very well-known authority for Bible stuff, and according to that work, he says the work of Hosea occurred in the last generation of the history of the northern kingdom. In Hosea 1 and verse 4, it indicates, I'm sorry for the people watching here. I managed to turn that PowerPoint off. Just a minute. Okay. This work of Hosea occurred in that last section of time around the time of King Jeroboam II. Maybe that's when it began. You remember Jeroboam the first was actually the first king over the northern tribes. Jeroboam, who took the throne when the kingdom divided after Solomon's death. So Jeroboam the first set Israel on its course of idolatry and sin and turning away from God. Well, Jeroboam the second wasn't much better, and at the time when he is ruling, that's when much of Hosea's writing is done. But Hosea prophesied for a long time. So we're going to see in a few minutes that his work actually covered the time span of about 6 different kings, all the way through the end of the kingdom. It also says that he probably, his ministry was well established by the time of Menachem, the king toward the end of the reigns of all those kings, because of some connections that the scriptures have with this king of Assyria called Tiglath-Pileser. Well, anyway, all of that just tells us that Hosea's ministry was taking place right there toward the end of the northern kingdom. Another illustration comes from the Shaw Pocket Bible Handbook, and some of these I'm not that familiar with, but there's some pretty good statements made here. Under C there, if you look at, let's see, where are we here? Yeah, here in this part right here, we're looking at how Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom for a span of about 50 years. And also, he was a contemporary of what other prophet? Can you see that from where you are? He was a contemporary of Amos. Yeah, we studied Amos the last few weeks. And Amos, remember, though, lived down in Judah, and he traveled up into Israel to do his prophecies. Well, the difference here is that Hosea lived in Israel. He was an Israelite himself. In fact, some of the things we read about him makes it look like perhaps he was of the tribe of Ephraim, which is the largest tribe in that kingdom. So as you see on the screen there, he preached during the time of even Isaiah and Micah. We'll talk about Micah later on. Micah would be one of the later prophets in this series. But it says there that Hosea lived to see the fall of the nation to the Assyrians in 722 BC. He was still alive then, probably was still trying to turn the people back to God. And then a couple of other points down there as you get down further toward the bottom of the page. Some of these authorities don't exactly match up. Like the next one there, D, says Hosea evidently compiled this book during the early years of Hezekiah. So you could see right there, I've highlighted that one. So this author is one from Nelson's Bible Encyclopedia, and he thinks that Hosea may have been active back earlier than this, during the reign of Hezekiah, that king who was pretty good but then turned bad later on. When Hosea began his ministry, it's pretty certain that Jeroboam II was the king then, but as his ministry continued, and I beg your pardon, I keep getting this PowerPoint on the screen here out of sync, and I'm trying to not do that. Okay. As we look at this, his work spans the reigns of the last 6 kings of Israel. Now, if you don't have your list of kings, like I think way back, maybe the last course we studied, we had a list of all the kings. But let me show you in your course book, if you turn a couple of pages over, and we're not to that part yet, but if you turn to page 65, up at the top of the page, there is that list of kings that took the leadership through the last part of Israel's existence. And I wanted to see if I could turn this page up a little bit. I'm going to run through some of this. We'll come back to it. But here they are. These are the kings that were in power when Hosea was prophesying. And if you look up there, he started off with Jeroboam II. After Jeroboam died, then you have the king named, where is he? Zechariah. And like it says at the top of that page there, assassination was the preferred method of changing the ruler back then. That was how you didn't have elections, you didn't have anything like national choice. It just says that each of these kings, with the exception of 1 or 2, was killed in order to get them out of office. So you had Zechariah, and then he was murdered by Shallum, and then you have Shallum coming up right there, and he was murdered by Menachem, and then Menachem is here, and he reigns about 10 years, and he's the one that we're not told how he died, but his son took over. His son's name was Pekahiah, and he reigned a couple of years. And then he was killed by one of his captains called Pekah, or Pekah, however you want to pronounce it. And then Pekah reigned about 8 years, and he was one who was killed by, let's see, Hosea. Hosea would be the last of the kings in this line here. And Hosea took the power from Pekah. Well, anyway, what I wanted you to look at was the way that all these kings joined together. Each one, pretty much, died at the hands of the one before. And so those 6 up there, from Zechariah down through Hosea, make up the ones that Hosea was involved with. And for those watching the recorded lesson, we'll put this slide up, and there they are, the 6 kings, with they're underlined in red, and we'll get to them later on when we actually talk about the details of their reigns. But this guy, Hosea, covered a long span. he was around for quite a long time. So let's go back up to the slide about the dates again. And we'll try to wrap that up pretty quickly. Let's see if I can make this one back up. Perhaps I can. Yeah, here we go. So we're back in the part about dates now. If you look at this last part here, we're told this, and this comes from a source called Deal, D-E-A-L. That's a Bible scholar that sometimes has interesting stuff to say. And he tells us here that Hosea was a younger contemporary of Amos and somewhat older than Isaiah and Micah. All right, well, we can kind of place him there then. He was a younger contemporary of Amos, which is, Amos might have had some influence over him. Look at this last statement, though. As a boy, he may have known the prophet Jonah, who flourished somewhat earlier. I hadn't thought about how these prophets overlap, but he may have actually had contact with Jonah. Remember Jonah, who went to the city of Nineveh. We know that it was during that historical period when the Assyrians were, fixing to start their conquest of Israel, and Jonah went there and preached to them. Well, this might indicate that he and Hosea had some time together. Maybe they actually met and visited with each other. Okay, so the date is just one of those technical things that we like to establish. Any thoughts or questions about that? Sometimes it seems like we kind of spin our wheels about these things, but once we get to looking at what happens in Hosea's prophecies, sometimes the date makes a difference. So let's continue then and go to the next section in your book, which is the setting. And this to me is more important than the date, because the setting is where we look at what things were going on, what context is there to all of this. And so as we dig into that, we'll try to put some sense to it. Let's look first of all at the religious setting. What were things like religiously in Israel during this time period? Well, look at the first point up there, and you see that Jeroboam the first, like we mentioned earlier, Jeroboam the first one, had introduced calf worship. How did he do that? Does anybody remember? How did Jeroboam introduce the calf worship?
He said he wanted to make things easier
Mm-hmm.
for the people, so they didn't have to go all the way to Jerusalem.
Exactly, yeah.
They could worship at Bethel or was it Gilgal?
Let's see, Dan and Bethel were the two places, yeah. And so that's what Jeroboam did. He said, well, if you guys up in this northern kingdom continue going down to Jerusalem to worship, that's too much. It's asking too much of you to make that long trip. And inside his own thinking, he was thinking, if they go down there to Jerusalem very much, they'll want to stay. They'll want to become part of that kingdom of Judah again. So he had these calves built and said, these are your gods. And more so than that, he went ahead and introduced false plans of worship. He built his own priesthood. They had some kind of a tabernacle or an altar where they worshiped, and they picked priests from folks who weren't of the tribe of Levi. So just a real, real human type of endeavor. Later on, you remember King Ahab? How did Ahab fit into the people going away from God? He was about 100 years or more after Jeroboam, and he had some help. What kind of help did Ahab have? He had Miss Jezebel, yeah. She was quite a right-hand guy, wasn't she? She was probably the brains of the whole operation, I think. But she and Ahab led the people almost completely into Baal worship. You remember Jezebel was from the Zidonian people, and they worshiped all these Baals. Well, what Hosea did was he took that information, which is really just history, and he used that to show the people of Israel how they were behaving like harlots. Yeah, I mean, it was a very clear indication of how God felt about them going away and worshiping idols. Hosea summarized these indictments against Israel, and it was the word harlotry that he used. Look right here, and you'll see that Israel had joined herself to these false gods, just as a prostitute would join herself to many men. One thing we don't often talk about is how the people of Israel and some in Judah, it wasn't just one pagan god that got their attention. Sometimes we use the name Baal as the pagan god that they worshipped, but Baal was like a box full of many little toy soldiers. Each one of them was another god. And so the Baals were a whole bunch of gods, and they had connections and cohorts among other pagan religions. And so, the Israelites could truly bounce from one pagan relationship to another one, just looking around for the best deal. And so that's what they did. In fact, if you take your Bible for just a second, we have some scriptures marked off there. And let's turn to chapter 2 and verse 5 of Hosea. Chapter 2 and at verse 5. And this is where, this chapter 2 we'll see later, is the place where Hosea starts laying down the charges against these people of Israel. And he says here in verse 5, "For their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has behaved shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink." Okay. Another thing we don't often catch on to is that these pagan religions and these pagan gods offered all kinds of materialistic perks to the people. You could go to the temple of Baal, for example, and besides cohorting with the women who served in that temple, you had access to good food and drink, and there were parties going on all the time in worship of these idols. So the people of Israel were drawn in by those materialistic things. And it kind of makes me wonder, I wonder if that's a process we see going on today. And if you think about it, it sure is. We have religious groups that think that by having all kinds of materialistic attraction, you can get people into your organization, and the pagan gods were that way. So, but what Hosea tells them here is that it's harlotry. It's like being taken away and becoming a prostitute to these other types of entities. In that same chapter, if you look at verses 12 and 13, here is where Hosea points out how God is going to treat this. He says, "And I will destroy her vines and her fig trees, of which she has said, These are my wages that my lovers have given me. So I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. I will punish her for the days of the Baals to which she burned incense. She decked herself with her earrings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, says the Lord." So Hosea's kind of painting this picture here of what this harlotry looked like. It was as though, you can picture Hosea looking out as his wife Gomer takes off after other men. She kind of leaves him behind. It's like that old song, old country song long ago, Ruby, Ruby, don't take your love to town. Maybe that's too old for you to remember. But that was, picture Hosea seeing his wife doing that. And so now he's bringing this home to him and saying, think about what God saw when you went off like that. And so that was part of what he wrote to express it. Our time's getting away from us tonight, so we don't have a lot of areas we can cover, but I did want you to look ahead there, starting under number 2A. Here are some specific areas in which and he uses the word whoredom here. That's what Brother Taylor labels it as. He says here are some areas where their spiritual whoredom was illustrated. And these areas included, if you look right there, starting with A lack of knowledge, idolatry, revolts. These people were actually participating in something like we see today, revolting against the establishment in their homes. Pride, transgressing the covenant. That's important too. Remember that Israel had a covenant with God. God had made them a covenant and said, if you'll do what I say, I'll be your God and you'll be my people. And then speaking lies against God and continually turning back from God. So we're going to take next week and begin there and look at some of those areas where the people of Israel were actually doing these prostituted type things. And if you will, read through that. Some of the verses really get specific, and you can tell Hosea is writing from kind of a position of pain. He's feeling the pain for the people of Israel, just like he felt the pain when his wife left him. And so we'll go from there, starting on the setting number 2 next week. Any thoughts as we wrap up? Any final insights or questions? Okay. Well, we must remember, though, that what was written aforetime was written for our learning. And so what we're seeing here is good information for us. We can pick up on some ways that people behaved back then and see it happening today. We want to thank our folks who are joining us by the recorded sermon or the recorded Bible lesson. We'd ask you, if you would, please, to make some comments or leave in any questions that you have on the comments section in our YouTube channel. Please don't go away with anything still fuzzy about this. We'd love to talk to you about any questions you might have. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening. We'll see you next time. Let me get out of there.